As I mentioned, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced her country will be downscaling its lockdown from level 4 to level 3 next week. That's very good, viewers. For our viewers in the land of the long white cloud, and thanks for watching, where just over the period there, New Zealand has had about 1,440 infections at last count and 12 deaths. With new cases, they're dropping to just a handful like Australia. So just a few minutes ago, I caught up with Simon Bridges, the New Zealand opposition leader, National Party leader. Simon Bridges, thanks so much for joining us. New Zealand today has announced that you're going from level 4 lockdown down to level 3, which is about where Australia is now. Did you go too far? Did the government take you too far into lockdown?
Look, I'm not critical of where we've been. I think, we've done the right thing in our circumstances. I do think, though, we're in lockdown for another week. We then go to level 3. I would argue, Chris, actually it is still palpably more restrictive than what you have in Aussie. And I think from here on in, what a lot of New Zealanders are going to start asking is the medicine more difficult and worse than the cure? And look, I think it's very tempting for us. In fact, I think it's the right thing to do to make the comparison with what you've done in Australia. We have had very similar health outcomes, but on the other side of it, look, you haven't shut down your economy, you've let things keep going, and so therefore have, I think, economically much stronger outcomes on that side of the ledger.
We've got most people working from home. We've had students in the main shunned from schools. That's going to go on for a few weeks. We've had pubs and restaurants shut. People can only go out in the public parks and the like in groups of 2 or family groups. Tell us how more onerous your shutdown still is, and still will be, in New Zealand.
Oh, significantly more onerous. Look, you really can't leave your home unless it's for exercise in your immediate vicinity. Next to nothing is open unless it's deemed what is called an essential services and a service, and that's very restrictive. So Chris, whereas you have some construction, manufacturing, they may seem like glib examples, but they're not necessarily. If you're in this, you can go to the barista and get a takeout coffee, you can get a haircut. None of those things are happening in New Zealand, and today this announcement says those things are going to go on longer because effectively the government hasn't, in public health terms, on testing, tracing, PPE, in my view, on a clear comparison, done as good a job as our cousins across the ditch have.
Well, we're pretty pleased with how things have turned out, as surely most New Zealanders are, but Australia is already talking about where we can go with restrictions from here. No one wants a second wave. No one wants to let this virus get away, but we do need to get the economy moving. Now, Australia and New Zealand have the same advantage of being island nations, and we've both blocked off our international borders. What do you say to this idea that we could open up in the next few weeks, perhaps an Anzac bubble, where we both keep our borders closed to other international arrivals, but Australians and New Zealanders can travel freely between the two countries?
Well, firstly, Chris, I want to acknowledge the point I think you're making at the start, which is actually we're blessed countries, right? And in New Zealand, as is true in Australia, actually we have a real chance to use your words, eliminate, squash, whatever you want to say, but do a really good job on this. We do, though, now in New Zealand certainly need to move to greater openness because, as I say, there'll be tens of thousands of people losing their businesses and their jobs. Look, in terms of Trans-Tasman and what we do, I think it's definitely worth exploring. Whether it's a few weeks away, I wouldn't perhaps be that optimistic, but I do certainly hope that our government and Jacinda Ardern are reaching out right now, if they haven't already, and talking with ScoMo and his officials about how we can do more together to get those borders at a level where they can open up. We can start over time seeing flights again and have a process where, look, we can trade or we can have two-way people contact in a way we haven't now for a bit of time.
I have to confess an interest in that because I do have a New Zealand holiday booked in July. I haven't quite given up hope, but perhaps. Right. Let's move to other issues now. Now, of course, this global pandemic has thrown all sorts of issues awry this year, and it's, of course, an American election year that's going ahead in November. But in New Zealand, you face an election, a national election, even sooner in September. How do you see that the campaign is going to be able to operate? Do you expect that you'll be able to have normal rallies and functions and handshaking, or is it going to be a very different sort of a campaign?
Look, it's a great question, and it's one I don't have a particularly good answer for, Chris, because I think the reality is, now, as we've been in lockdown, we've put aside campaigning. We're very much focused on COVID-19. Inevitably, though, we're going to have to start thinking about these things pretty soon, because, as you say, we have an election on 19 September. I think there are still issues about whether it proceeds. My preference is it does. You know, I think it's a big thing to say, let's do away with an election date. But they're very real questions. I was just talking to the President of the National Party about issues with our conference, our national conference, questions about how we pick our, and it's a slightly different system to yours over there, but our list of members of Parliament. Look, can we go door knocking? These are things we're going to have to think through. Winston Peters, you know, obviously a well-known New Zealand politician, he's called for an election in November rather than September. I think these are things that in coming weeks, particularly as we've stayed in lockdown and we go to level 3, which is still a very restricted set of settings in this country, that question mark around the election is going to grow louder. Yeah, that idea of putting it back just by 2 or 3 months makes a bit of sense, given you're getting away from the flu season and more time for normality to return. Just on the political divide, I suppose, the political debate too, one thing you've done in New Zealand that I think people around the world would see as a popular move, and that is you've had your politicians take a pay cut because of the coronavirus. Yeah, look, I have members of the executive, the cabinet have, and look, I think it's simply a basic point, isn't it, that we are in this together. As we see Kiwis doing it tough, losing their job, going to 4-day weeks, having significant pay cuts, I think it was the right thing to do, and something, as I say, that wasn't just a government move, but I bought into as well. Now, just finally on that election, as we look to whether it's in September 19, or is pushed back, you, of course, the National Party hold more seats than Labor and the Greens put together. The key here is New Zealand First and Winston Peters. Do you rule out doing any deals with Winston Peters in the future if you need him and New Zealand First to form government after an election? I do. I was quite clear on that earlier this year. And I could bore you with the history of it, but ultimately I suppose it's a question of trust. We don't have it on our side. He's mucked us around in the past, and we don't want to be mucked around again. I think that's how many New Zealanders feel. What that does do, Chris, is it gives New Zealanders a very simple choice at the next election. Literally, it is between the same old what they've had, a coalition of Labor, Greens and New Zealand First, or it's a national NACT as a small libertarian party, if you like, to one side of us, a government after September 19. So, in that regard, it's, I suppose, a reasonably straightforward election for New Zealand. Yeah, it clarifies the choice. Just finally, Simon Bridges, what mark would you give Jacinda Ardern out of 10 for her handling of the coronavirus pandemic? I think on communications, it's been impeccable. I think the reality is, though, the implementation under that has been much less so, whether it's on the testing, the tracing, the PPE, or the handling of some complex issues like when schools go back. So communications, look, I would say 10 out of 10. On those other issues, I think much lower. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Chris.